Prairie Town, Midwestern United States, fall 1945. The leaves were turning gold and rust, falling in clusters from maples that lined the dusty road, and with each gust of wind that carried them into the air, Martha Reynolds could almost believe she heard something more than rustling. She could almost hear something she had longed to hear for more than a year, something that would change everything or confirm the wound she feared was permanent. Her farmhouse sat on a gentle rise, its white paint peeling, porch boards weather-worn, swinging gate creaking, and in the evenings the shadows from the barn stretched long across the yard, darkening in ways that matched the hollow in her chest she was learning to live with. It was in the autumn of 1944 when Henry Turner came home wounded, not fully, missing part of his leg, eyes haunted, voice quieter than before. He had served in Europe with the 3rd Infantry Division, fought through the hedgerows, the bombed towns, evacuated from field hospitals, but always pressed forward until the orders said, "Pull back," until the front collapsed and then held. Henry came to Martha's doorstep one cold evening, coat tattered, hands shaking with frost and fatigue, and Martha, ever the nurse's daughter, bound his wounds, eased his fever, brought him inside, raised the lantern, held his hand in the dark, and for the first time in months Henry said, "I'll come back in the fall." She believed him, or needed to. They sat in the kitchen with shadows dancing from the kerosene lamp, spoke little, sometimes laughter, mostly silence. Henry would smile when he thought Martha wasn't looking, pull her close when the wind rattled the windows, promise that once things settled, once the war was over, the paperwork cleared, the loss forgiven, he'd return, whole in body, or at least whole in spirit. Then, one crisp fall morning, as frost edged the doorframe and the smell of wood smoke lingered, Henry kissed her hands, touched her hair, left with a pack on his back, whisper of, "I'll see you in the fall again," and walked down the long driveway, the gate banging softly behind him. Martha stood on the porch, watching him go, heart hammering, ring on her finger glinting in the dawn light, wondering if hope could carry across distance, across war. The months rolled on, pale winter snows, spring rains, summer heat that baked the fields to dust. Martha wrote letters every week, addressed them to camp addresses, hospital wards, often got returned, sometimes never left the post office. She heard rumors, soldiers not coming back, listed missing in action, others prisoners, some kind of bureaucratic limbo no one spoke of. But still, she kept the lamp burning in her window, a light for him, and every night sat on the porch with a small journal in her lap, listening for any sound, a wagon, a train whistle, or footsteps. And now it is the last day of fall, 1945, dusk settling early, sky bruised purple, wind carrying the scent of fallen leaves and cold air, Martha wrapped in her shawl, journal open, ring in her pocket, listening. Porch boards groan, a footstep, then another, slow, cautious, familiar. If this story moves you the way it moved me in writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more stories that touch, inspire, surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. It was the autumn of 1944 when Henry Turner first arrived in Prairie Town, not as a returning son, but as a soldier between worlds, a man no longer at war but not yet home, walking with a limp down a dirt road lined with cornstalks long since harvested, carrying a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and the weight of too many battles in his chest. He had left for Europe in 1942 with the usual promises and patriotic fervor that filled parades and train platforms. But when he returned, there was no brass band, no ceremony, just a worn-out man stepping off a bus in a town that hadn't seen him in 3 years and might not have recognized him if they had. Henry didn't go to his childhood home first. He went to Martha's. The Reynolds family farmhouse stood on the same land it always had, though the fence posts leaned now and the porch sagged a little more with each season. Martha, who had once braided her hair in ribbons and read poetry by candlelight, now wore her sleeves rolled and kept a rifle by the back door, not from fear, but from habit, from a life lived waiting for letters that often didn't come. When she saw him, thinner, older, his left leg dragging just enough to make each step look painful, she didn't run to him or cry or ask questions. She simply opened the door and said, "Come in before the frost bites deeper." And he did. They didn't speak much that first night. Henry sat at the table while Martha lit the kerosene lamp and heated water on the stove. She cleaned the wound on his shoulder that hadn't fully healed, rubbed salve onto the burn marks along his ribs, bandaged his calf where a piece of shrapnel had cut deeper than doctors had time to fix. She never asked what had happened. He never told her. But in the silence, in the movements of her hands, in the stillness between spoonfuls of stew, something passed between them. Not a romance reborn, not a story rekindled, but a recognition that even if the world had broken them, they still remembered the shape of each other. Over the following weeks, Henry stayed. Not openly, not with papers or permits or parade welcomes, but quietly, behind curtains drawn tight at night, stepping softly across the porch when he helped bring in firewood, ducking behind the barn when anyone rode past. He was, in every sense, a ghost among the living, a soldier who should not yet have returned, a man still on record in a hospital file somewhere in Indiana or Kentucky, or maybe still marked as overseas. Martha didn't mind. In the quiet hours before dawn, she would sit with him on the back steps, a blanket over their knees, and they'd watch the horizon for no reason at all, not looking for answers, just for stillness. He'd tell her in fragments about the mud of Anzio, the frozen earth in Alsace, the way the air smelled just before shelling, and she'd listen not to the stories, but to the way he told them, how his voice cracked when he mentioned a name he didn't finish, how he paused when describing a street in a town whose name she never learned. One night, after the first frost silvered the fields and the stars hung low like lanterns barely lit, Henry turned to her and said, "I can't stay." She nodded. She'd known. There was no way to remain invisible forever. Patrols were tightening, neighbors starting to ask questions, and he was restless, not because he didn't love her, but because the war had taught him to never stop moving. "But I'll come back," he said, voice hoarse, "when the leaves turn again. I'll be on that road walking up to this porch. I swear it." She didn't ask where he was going or how. She just took the ring from his hand, a small silver band, nothing fancy, probably traded or found, and slipped it onto a string she tied around her neck. It rested there, warm against her skin. At dawn, he packed his things. No uniform, just a flannel shirt, a battered jacket, the same limp, the same quiet smile. He kissed her once on the forehead, nothing more, and walked down the path through the yard, past the apple tree that hadn't borne fruit that year, and out the creaky gate, never looking back, as though he knew she'd be watching. And she did. Every day after that, Martha kept her routine, tended to the chickens, mended clothes, made preserves with the last peaches of the season. She didn't speak much about Henry to anyone, not because she was ashamed, but because some things you keep in your chest, close to the heart, and let them breathe in silence. She wrote him letters, dozens, to army offices, to Red Cross locations, to addresses she found in old war magazines. Most came back, a few disappeared, none answered. Still, she waited, not with desperation but with a steady faith, the kind that sits quietly at the table, night after night, leaving an extra plate just in case. The winter of 1944 bled slowly into the new year, not with drama or snowstorms, but with a steady, quiet cold that sank into the bones of the land and the people who lived on it. The kind of cold that didn't shout but whispered, made every board in the house creak like it remembered warmer days, made each morning feel like a question with no answer. Martha moved through the days the way someone moves through a fog, aware, precise, but dulled at the edges. She rose before the sun, lit the stove, brought in wood, fed the animals. Her hands, red from scrubbing and the sting of wind, were always busy. It was her mind that drifted, always circling back to that last morning, to the sound of the gate closing, to the quiet promise. "I'll be back when the leaves turn." She wrote to Henry weekly, always on the same stationery, with the same pen, at the same corner of the table, with the same lamp burning beside her. Her words were careful, not desperate. She told him about the hens and the weather, the neighbors and the apples that never ripened. She told him about the dreams, the ones that woke her at 3 in the morning with his name on her lips, the ones where he sat beside her and didn't say a word, just looked at her like he'd never left. She addressed the letters to every place she could think of, to army depots, recovery wards, field hospitals, discharge offices. She even wrote to the Red Cross. Some letters came back unopened, stamped undeliverable. Others were never returned at all. Those were the worst, the ones that vanished, because in their silence they said, "We don't know where he is. We don't know if he's still alive." She never spoke about the letters. Not to her father, who still polished his old service medals every Sunday, even though he hadn't worn a uniform since the Great War. Not to the postmaster, who started giving her pitying looks by February. Not even to herself, when she stared at the empty chair across the kitchen and imagined his coat hanging behind the door. The town was kind, mostly. Prairie Town was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone else's habits, but not necessarily their thoughts. People would nod to her at church, send over pies, ask polite roundabout questions like, "Still no word from the front?" or "Any chance he's stateside?" And Martha, always composed, would smile a little and say, "Not yet, but I've got time." But time was a strange thing in those months. It stretched out like the frozen road that led into town, featureless, quiet, endless. And the silence wasn't just in the mailbox, it was in her own body. Her voice grew softer, her movements slower. Her eyes, once bright, took on a fixed, far-off shine, like she was always watching something just out of reach. One evening in January, when the wind blew so hard it knocked snow from the trees in sheets, she sat by the window, letter in hand, and didn't move for over an hour. She stared at the driveway, at the 2 faint ruts in the snow that hadn't seen wagon wheels in weeks, and in that stillness, something inside her cracked just enough for the tears to come. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet drops slipping down her face as she clutched the letter and whispered, "I'm still here. I'm still waiting." She kept a journal. Not every day, not neatly, but when she couldn't speak, when the ache was too wide for letters, she wrote for herself, and sometimes for him, in case he ever came back and asked her what he'd missed. She wrote, "It snowed last night. The wind howled like a train whistle. I thought I heard boots on the porch. I made your favorite, cornbread and stew. Couldn't eat it. The cat won't sit in your chair anymore. I think she knows. I keep finding your shadow in corners. Today, I stopped writing your name on the envelope before I finished the letter. It scared me how natural that felt." But she didn't stop. Not really. The ink never ran dry. The hope never completely faded. There were whispers in town by spring, whispers that Henry had gone AWOL, that maybe he never existed, that Martha had made up the whole thing. Some said from grief, others said from pride. A few crueler tongues muttered that a woman living alone couldn't be trusted, especially one who got so many letters returned and never explained why. But she didn't defend herself. She kept baking bread, she kept fixing the roof, she kept sitting on the porch with the same shawl and the same look in her eyes, a look like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Because the thing about silence is, eventually it becomes familiar. You stop fearing it, you start listening to it. And sometimes, in the very center of silence, you can almost hear a heartbeat or footsteps, even when no one's there. And as the days grew longer again, as the snow melted into the dirt path and the mailbox stood tall with its rusted flag, Martha waited, not with despair, but with the kind of patience that belongs to women who've already lost more than they can say and still believe something might return to them if only they keep the door unlocked, the light on, and the journal open on the porch table just in case. By the time summer arrived, the kind that baked the earth and made the air hum with insects and distant thunder, Martha Reynolds had learned to live with the silence, not in bitterness, but in the quiet dignity of someone who had stopped asking questions aloud and instead started listening to the answers that come in dreams, in wind, in the way a child's eyes look back at you with a knowing far. Too deep for their years. The boy, her boy, was named James, but no one in town ever called him that, not really. Most just referred to him as Martha's little one, or that boy on the hill. He was about 2.5 now, with hair the color of wheat in early September, and eyes that didn't smile easily, even when he laughed. He followed Martha everywhere, quiet and observant, with a small wooden horse always clutched in one hand and a string of unanswered questions in the other, even if he didn't yet know how to ask them. No one had ever officially asked Martha who the father was. Not the preacher, not the doctor, not the neighbors who passed her at the general store. But the silence around the question had begun to grow louder than the question itself. There were glances now, long, lingering looks that said more than words ever could. There were pauses in conversation when she walked by. Even the postmaster, who used to hand her returned letters with a shrug, now barely met her gaze when she picked up her mail. There were whispers, of course, that she'd been taken advantage of during the war, that she'd imagined someone who never existed, that Henry had come back and left again without ever meaning a word he said, that the child was someone else's entirely, a local boy, a married man, a stranger from a passing train. But what stung the most wasn't the gossip. It was the way the town, which had once embraced her with casseroles and condolences, now kept its warmth just out of reach, polite but distant, as if her silence had become a kind of threat, as if her refusal to explain was an accusation. She said nothing, not to them, not to James. But on some nights, when the sky turned the same shade of blue as Henry's eyes and the wind rustled the cornrows behind the barn, she'd sit with James on the porch swing, holding him against her chest, and whisper stories, not of the war, not of soldiers or promises or porches, but of rivers that remembered your name, of trees that could carry messages between worlds, of men who kept their word. Even if time tried to steal it, James would listen, eyes wide, thumb pressed to his lip, and sometimes just before sleep took him, he'd ask, "Is my daddy coming?" And Martha, with her voice steady and her heart breaking anew each time, would say, "He's finding his way home. Some journeys take longer than others." No one in town ever saw her cry. Not when the preacher's wife stopped inviting her to the quilting circles. Not when 2 young mothers pulled their children away from James at the church picnic. Not even when she overheard the grocer telling someone, "A boy needs a father." Not just a story, but she wept, not loudly, never where James could see, but in the barn, where Henry had once hidden behind stacks of hay, in the kitchen, where his letter still sat in the drawer, in the night when a floorboard creaked and for half a second she thought it might be him. The thing was, James had his smile, that lopsided, soft kind of grin that pulled just slightly more on the left than the right. He had Henry's quietness too, his way of watching a room before stepping into it, his habit of curling his fingers in his sleep like he was still holding something precious. The town might not have wanted to say his name, but every time she looked at James, Martha knew she'd never forget it. There was one woman who never asked, never gossiped. Mrs. Carter, widow, retired school teacher and fierce keeper of secrets. She lived down the road and brought over canned peaches in the summer and wool blankets in the winter, never staying long, never prying. One afternoon, as she handed Martha a jar and looked down at James playing in the dirt with a broken tin soldier, she said, "You don't owe anyone a word, but he'll ask one day. And you'll need to give him the truth, not the town's version, yours." Martha nodded. She knew that day would come. It was already coming in questions half-formed and drawings that always had 3 people, even though only 2 sat at the table. So she started writing again, not letters, but pages, for James, for someday. She wrote about the man who came home when no one else believed he would. About the nights he spent with her, not in passion, but in presence, about how he had promised to return, about how she believed him, still did, even now, because some stories don't end when people stop telling them. Some live on in the spaces between between seasons, between footsteps, between one heartbeat and the next. It was the last day of November, the kind of cold that settled deep in the lungs, where breath turned to mist, and even the dogs in town barked less, not out of fear, but respect for the quiet. The trees were bare, their branches reaching out like fingers remembering what it felt like to hold leaves, and the fields beyond the Reynolds farmhouse stretched grey and still, waiting for snow, waiting for something. Martha woke early that morning, as she always did, wrapped James in an extra blanket, fed the chickens, watched the sky turn from blue to steel through the frost-glazed kitchen window. The calendar on the wall read November 30th. She stared at it longer than she meant to. Her fingers brushed the ring around her neck, the same one she'd tied to a ribbon 2 falls ago, still warm from her skin. She hadn't let herself count days. Not really, but something in her chest had been building all month. Not quite hope, not quite pain, something quieter, deeper, like a door creaking slowly open inside her. The sun dipped early, the way it does when winter's close. Martha lit the stove, pulled James onto her lap with his blanket and a book, read without really seeing the words. Her ears were tuned to the wind, to the distant creak of tree limbs, to every small sound that might mean something more. Then it happened. Just as twilight fell, that strange blue hour where the world feels both asleep and wide awake, there was a sound, a step, slow, heavy, familiar. Then another. The porch boards groaned the way they had once before, not under weight, but under memory. Martha froze, hand still on James's shoulder, breath caught in her throat. There was a shadow behind the curtain. Not long, not tall, but unmistakably human. She stood, gently set the boy aside, and walked to the door. Not quickly, not hesitantly, but as if her entire life had been leading her toward this single motion. She didn't open it right away. She listened. One more footstep, one breath. And then she pulled the door wide. There he was, Henry, older, thinner, bearded. His hair was streaked with grey at the temples, and his coat hung off him like it had once belonged to someone stronger. His eyes were the same, except they carried more now. More silence, more sorrow, more of the war he never spoke of. He didn't speak at first, neither did she. They simply looked at each other, her hands still clutching the doorframe, his hands shaking slightly from cold or memory or both. Then, almost too softly to hear, he said, "You kept the light on." She nodded. "You said you'd come in the fall." He stepped forward, one slow step at a time, as if afraid she might vanish. When he reached the edge of the porch, his hand brushed against the railing, and then, in the quiet that followed, he reached out and touched her face, gently, reverently, like it was something sacred. "I tried to write," he said. They moved us. A lot. I lost everything. My pack, my papers, my name, almost. "I know," she said, and she did. He had been in a veterans camp in Oregon, one of many set up for soldiers, who didn't quite fit the neat checkboxes of discharge, whose injuries weren't visible enough to be declared broken, but deep enough to make them wonder. It had taken him over a year to find a way back. "I walked the last 10 miles, he added, like it mattered. Martha looked at him for a long time. Then, as if it had never been in question, she stepped aside and let him in. James was at the edge of the hallway, peeking from behind the doorframe, his toy horse in hand, his eyes wide, unsure. Henry turned toward him slowly. "Is that him?" Martha nodded. Henry knelt, not all the way, his legs stiff, but enough to meet the boy's eyes. "You don't know me," he said quietly, "but I know you. I've known you in every step I took to get here." James didn't say anything, just looked at him. Then, after a long moment, he took a step forward and placed the toy horse in Henry's hand. And that was enough. They didn't rush to speak. They didn't make promises or declarations. They just sat that night, all 3 of them, in the living room, the fire crackling, the wind pressing softly at the windows, and no one said the word home, but all of them felt it, because sometimes a promise is not kept on time. Sometimes it's broken and bent, worn thin by war and years and silence, but if it's held in the heart long enough, it can still find its way back. And when it does, even a single footstep on an old porch can sound like the loudest answer in the world. In the days that followed Henry's return, the house did not erupt in celebration. There was no parade, no music, no visitors bearing casseroles or congratulations, but something quieter happened, something deeper. The silence that had settled in every room, in every floorboard, in every drawer where Martha had tucked away years of unanswered letters, began to soften, not disappear, but loosen its grip just enough to let breath in. They did not speak of what had been lost, not in detail, not out loud, because there are some wounds that do not need naming to be understood, and there was already so much said in the way Henry touched the doorframe every morning, as if grateful it still stood, or in the way Martha sat at the table beside him, not expecting stories, just offering presents. James began to say his name. Not Papa, not yet, but Henry, always with a question at the end, as if testing whether the sound would stay, and each time Henry answered, with a nod, a smile, a story told in pieces, it became a little more real. The porch became their favorite place. The same steps where Martha once waited and listened for a promise now held 3 chairs, and in the evenings, as the light fell golden across the fields, they sat with mugs of tea and quiet laughter, the air no longer heavy with longing, but filled with the kind of stillness that means something is finally, fully present. Henry never asked for forgiveness. Martha never asked for explanations. That was not the kind of love they had. Theirs was the kind that waited without demanding, that returned without needing to be perfect. A love that had been tested by distance, silence, and the world's worst inventions, and still found its way back in footsteps and firelight and the quiet sharing of space. One evening, James pulled a folded piece of paper from the drawer and asked Martha to read it. It was the letter, the one Henry had left behind when he first walked away. She hadn't read it aloud before. She wasn't sure she could. But this time, with Henry sitting beside her and James nestled against her leg, she opened it. The paper was worn thin, but the words held, "If I don't come back, know that I wanted to, that every part of me that still believed in anything believed in you." There was silence after she read it, not the aching kind, not the lonely kind, but the silence of 3 people breathing the same air, in the same room, under the same roof, and knowing that against all odds they had made it. The war had taken years they would never recover, but it had not taken everything, because the house still stood, the child still laughed, and the man who once walked away now sat close enough to touch. Sometimes love returns late, but when it does, when it walks up the steps of a porch worn by weather and memory, it brings with it not just the past, but the chance to begin again. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it in the creak of the floorboards, in the breath before sleep, in the footsteps that echo not with loss, but with homecoming. We share stories like this every day, true tales that move, inspire, and stay with you long after they end. If this story touched you the way it touched us while writing it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments. What part stayed with you most?